What's up, y'all? Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. Before we get started, I would like to invite you to join our subscriber program. Convergence Magazine is an independent publication that relies on the generosity of our readers and listeners to create the rigorous, thoughtful takes that you've come to expect from us, week in and week out. You can become a subscriber at convergencemag.com/donate. Any amount helps, either as a one-time donation or a recurring monthly or annual subscription. Also, if you don't have the cash, another way you can help support this show is by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen. This helps boost the show and strengthens the ability of the various podcast platforms' algorithms to surface it to other like-minded listeners so that we can expand our community of practice. This week on the show, I'm first joined by the Executive Director of Media Justice, Stephen Renderos, to discuss the nefarious activities of the FCC. Then, the Executive Director of Women's March, Rachel O'Leary Carmona, joins me to talk about what the impact of mass demonstrations can be in this moment, following on the heels of their recent People's March in Washington, D.C. But first, of course, these headlines. The way that the sweeping executive order on gender is being practically implemented is really coming into focus. We're seeing things ranging from indefinite holds on passport processing to orders about gender in schools. But I really want to bring your attention to a lawsuit that an incarcerated trans woman has brought against the federal government. On January 21st, she was immediately transferred to solitary confinement and denied contact with other people in anticipation of further instructions from the executive branch. Suing the president from federal prison is an immense act of courage. Incarcerated people are subject to extreme surveillance and repression in normal circumstances and face retribution for speaking out or even simply advocating for themselves. There's a lot at stake for the plaintiff and for all incarcerated trans people, because this lawsuit isn't just about injunctive relief for the plaintiff as an individual. It also really highlights the pure absurdity of this executive order and how frankly unenforceable a lot of it is. During the signing ceremony for the Lake and Riley Act, Trump also announced that he's ordering a huge detention facility to be constructed at Guantanamo Bay. If this feels ominous to you, you are not alone. The plan links Trump's campaign against immigrants to the state crimes of the so-called War on Terror. My mind immediately jumped to Guantanamo's use as a prison, holding people, torturing them in many cases, in indefinite detention with no opportunity for due process, some of whom were determined to be innocent of any charges after sometimes years of detention. It also, of course, calls to mind the creation of concentration camps for Japanese Americans during World War II, when the federal government used military resources to round up and detain tens of thousands of civilians for the supposed threat of their ancestry. And I've got to ask at this juncture, where are the Democrats on this? Between this and this week's short-lived Office of Management and Budget freeze of all federal funding, this should be a kick in the ass. It's time that they start behaving like a real opposition party. And in the absence of that, I guess it's just time for us to get better organized. Our friends at Truthout have a great story this week investigating the connections between the insurance industry and fossil fuel companies. It's not just that the insurance titans are insuring the operations of fossil fuel producers. It turns out they're also investors in those companies. These are the same companies who are abandoning homeowners in California and across the West, citing that insuring homes in wildfire-prone areas is simply too risky. What's wild to me is that these companies could decide that it's climate change that's too risky, but they're too busy enjoying the financial windfall of playing both sides. We'll stick a link to this story in the show notes. Also, nearly 2 million federal employees received an email earlier this week containing a deferred resignation offer promising to pay their full salary and benefits through the end of September if they simply respond to the email with the word resign by February 6th. Pains me to feel like I have to say this, but if you or anyone you know received this email, which sounds like a pretty sweet deal, it literally says or suggests that employees could use the time to, quote, take a nice vacation, ! I just want to remind you, consider the source. There's no congressionally approved budget to pay people to not work for months at a time, and this is an offer from Donald Trump, who built his career by refusing to pay real estate contractors time and time again, and Elon Musk, who made the exact same promise to Twitter employees, who never saw a dime and were eventually fired anyway for, quote, cause. This isn't the only missive from OPM that's come out in the last 2 weeks. 404 Media has a great story this week about how several of these orders still had document metadata exposing their original authors. Those authors? previously employed by the Heritage Foundation, the architects of Project 2025. Trump tried to distance himself from Heritage on the campaign trail, but it turns out you can't fool Reddit. And just yesterday, the new chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr, decided it's time to try and defund the greatest woke communist threat to our nation, Daniel Tiger. He's requested an investigation into PBS and NPR, claiming they're operating as for-profit entities while receiving federal funding by announcing their financial sponsors on air. It should come as no surprise that this attack on nominally publicly funded media is part of their blitz to dismantle any remaining checks and balances to their authoritarian plans. This is a politically partisan, bad faith maneuver intended to shut down a free press and anything that seems like dissent. On that note, my first guest today is the Executive Director of Media Justice and a longtime comrade of mine, Stephen Renderos. Media Justice is a national racial justice organization advancing media and technology rights of people of color. Stephen, it's really good to see you today. I mean, could be under
really
better
good to see you too.
circumstances.
No, for sure. But it's really great to be here with you.
Obviously this, spurious investigation into NPR and PBS is bad news for a free press, but last week, Carr also reinstated these complaints against television stations for supposed preferential treatment in favor of Kamala Harris. Could you tell us a bit about what ideally the FCC should be doing and who Brendan Carr is?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Federal Communications Commission is supposed to be an independent federal body that's really focused on ensuring that everybody in the United States has access to the communications infrastructure of our time. Obviously, over the last 100 or so years, that infrastructure has changed, going from telephones to radio to TV to the internet. And the FCC has played a strategic role in ensuring that people have access to the things that they need. However, Brendan Carr, there's a lot of things to say about him. First is, he was appointed under Donald Trump as FCC commissioner back in 2017. Prior to that, he had been the general counsel for the chair at that time, or a commissioner at that time, Republican commissioner named Ajit Pai. So he comes from this kind of cloth of Republican FCC commissioners. He's also famously, I think at this point, the only person who had contributed actual writing to Project 2025 who is stationed in a leadership position inside of the administration right now.
Interesting.
And he wrote the section on the Federal Communications Commission. And his thing is weaponizing freedom of speech by decrying anything that doesn't align with Trump or a conservative point of view as evidence of political bias, which is why he's going after ABC and NBC, which is why he's going after public media.
Yeah.
And also why he's trying to go after tech companies as well.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because it feels like this is that's kind of a talking point that we've heard from haters on the internet for a really long time, but he's really let's institutionalize this and say that this is the policy of the federal government, that criticizing the Trump administration is part of the this is part of this free speech regime that we're trying to implement.
I mean, he calls the media system the censorship cartel, alongside with the role that social media platforms play. And I'm and the thing is, we see this is straight out of the Trump playbook of, of contradictions, of saying we are free speech warriors. And yet the actions over the last couple of weeks are all indicating to us that a crackdown on free speech is the thing that he wants, you know? So yeah, I mean, I think that's Brendan Carr is going to be an instrument that will weaken the independence of the Federal Communications Commission and just make it another tool in Trump's toolbox to go after, anybody he deems as being the opposition.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the complaints themselves. And I know that the previous chairperson of the FCC had tossed them out as kind of spurious or like not worth their consideration. But like, what are the complaints that he revived, and like, what does that kind of say to us about threats to both corporate and independent media?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things, and this is kind of pulling a piece of the playbook from the civil rights movement and the way that the civil rights movement engaged with the media system that was very hostile to amplifying their stories or their perspective. Back in the 60s and 70s, many civil rights organizations very deliberately challenged the licenses of local TV stations because
Mhm.
they're essentially obligated. In exchange for having access to the public airwaves, they're obligated to do certain things, and any individual person can file a complaint against a local TV station, and that's in fact like what many civil rights leaders did, including famously Medgar Evers, who filed complaints against many local TV stations in Mississippi for only giving a one-sided view of issues and constantly platforming KKK members and never bringing
Mhm.
anybody from the civil rights movement to share a differing perspective. That the mechanisms are still there. And so what you see in this current kind of political context is you see conservatives filing complaints against local TV stations who they say are misleading the public. And so famously, this isn't part of the complaints that Carr reinstated, but there was a complaint filed against the Des Moines Register for publishing a poll in Iowa leading up to one of the debates where it showed that Kamala Harris might be up on Trump, and there were complaints filed against the Des Moines Register, a lawsuit now actually by a conservative law firm going after that newspaper. That's akin to the kinds of complaints that were filed against the local TV stations ABC, NBC, and CBS for broadcasting. In one case, it had to do with broadcasting an interview with Kamala Harris that was edited. In another case, it had to do with the amount of airtime that she was given during a debate. And another
Mhm.
time it had to do with Kamala Harris showing up on SNL. So it's very innocuous things, but they're being weaponized to go after these local TV stations. And the FCC, is the main body that receives those complaints, and they're required to like consider them and do something about it. And the previous chair, the outgoing chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, dismissed them prior to the new administration coming in, but did so in a way in which it just allowed an opportunity for Brendan Carr to come in and reinstate them. So I think what it means, is that it is very likely that the existing media infrastructure that we have is likely to continue to be a target of the right. Concerted attacks against their ability to just do what they do, and it's not like they are liberal bastions of
Right.
I wish, but they're
Yeah.
not. But it does mean that we're likely to see those kinds of attacks that will lead to a regression in what that corporate media is willing to do and not willing to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it seems like a lot of the kinds of corporate media that are going to be at the center of very high profile complaints are more likely to want to mitigate their risk than anything
And that's what
else.
they've done.
Yeah.
They settled a lawsuit with Trump. ABC, I think, settled a lawsuit with Trump, um, who he alleged they were discriminating against him, and rather than see the case out through court, they settled and they paid I don't know how many millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. Facebook recently did the same thing,
Hmm.
to settle another lawsuit against Trump. So, yeah, I mean, corporate media, they're not going to preserve democracy. They will preserve
Yeah.
their bottom line. So that's
Yep.
exactly what's going to happen here.
Yeah, and I feel like the implication here too is this sort of like embroification of social media is also part of this. That like, Mark Zuckerberg, it feels like is trying to cover his own ass when
Yeah.
it comes to these accusations of bias.
Yeah.
And so
He's
he's
not done with
swinging
his
hard, right?
incel tour. He's
Yeah,
still on the incel tour for sure.
totally.
Yeah, I mean, I think really what it comes down to is trying to save his behind from further scrutiny, because Brendan Carr is willing to do things against the platforms like eliminating Section 230 and making them legally liable for the content that's published on their platforms. But it's also a way to try to curry favor with an administration that they stand to gain a lot of money from. One of the
Totally.
hidden figures with the FCC is Elon Musk, as someone who has infrastructure that he's deployed, satellite infrastructure, to provide broadband access. He stands to gain a lot by an FCC that's willing to make it easier for him to access federal funds to expand his broadband monopoly.
Yeah. The kleptocracy at work, really.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, I gotta ask, like, this is feels like a kind of a dire picture of where we're at, but of course I have to ask, like, what are you all working on in this time, thinking about this rapidly changing landscape, and what can fighting organizations, both as like, with bases like base building organizations, and frankly, like fighting organizations that are media organizations, like, what can we do about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think first off is to see this media terrain as terrain that we have to struggle over. We absolutely have to make it incredibly difficult for this incoming administration to do what it wants to do. The good news is that, you know, these federal agencies have mechanisms that they have to respond to. The FCC in particular, constantly, anytime they want to do something, has to engage the public in asking them what they think before they take any particular action. In the days of net neutrality, I think in the work that we did together, Caden, we proved this, that like you can actually get a lot of people to engage with an independent agency like the FCC, and we got millions of comments around net neutrality. Those are comments that this agency, by law, has to actually read and consider. So there are ways that we may not be fully capable of stopping them from doing some of the worst things that they want to do, but we can slow them down. And I think that is incredibly important in this moment to buy us some time. The other thing I would say that groups like us can be doing, and that we're doing, is finding ways to support the media infrastructure that really reflects the kind of world we're trying to go to. And so there's two things I would say to that for folks. Like, get familiar with your local community media institutions, your community radio stations, your public access TV stations. Those are worthy of your support. And movement media institutions are critical. Listening to you at the top of the hour be like, subscribe to us. And I was like, yeah, that's what I need to do. I need to subscribe to Convergence Magazine, to Scalawag, to Truth Out, to all the movement media outlets out there that are actually helping to hold the line around analysis in this moment, especially as the culture wars ramp up, especially as our educational institutions get attacked. And so some of the histories and political context that we really need to understand to fight in this moment are not showing up in the places that we would expect. So movement media plays a very critical role in this moment. So I would say support. So slow them down, support the institutions that reflect the world that we want, and let's fight for that.
That's right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Stephen, to break a lot of that down and also give us some of this backstory. One of the things I always love about talking to you is how much like historical knowledge about the way that our movements have interacted with the media, how that's looked for generations, not just this sort of like immediate moment. It's always good to see you.
It's great to see you, and you've been a huge inspiration for me. One quick anecdote for me. I remember at Netroots Nation many years ago when Twitter was for sale, and you very boldly said, like, we should go out there and try to buy this thing. And it always sticks with me because that seemed like an inflection point. Now, obviously, like none of us, independently could have purchased it, but there was an idea there that I've always appreciated, the boldness of your ideas. I've always appreciated something you said about, stepping back from the platforms that we are on. If we do that, we're conceding space to fascists, and we're kind of living that moment now. So I always think about that when I'm thinking about my choices of where to show up.
Oh, thank you so much. I stand by all of those things, like I wish we could have bought Twitter in like 20, whatever that was. Gosh, that was
so long
a
ago.
decade ago or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Take care. And I'm sure we're going to talk again on the pod soon about all of the great work that y'all are doing in media justice.
For sure. Thank you, Caden.
All right. As you probably remember, the 2017 Women's March was the largest single-day march in U.S. history, with over 500,000 folks participating. As an organization, the Women's March has continued to organize ongoing campaigns and actions for the past 8 years, and most recently co-led the People's March on Washington, D.C. on January 18th. While this year's People's March didn't have the same kind of record turnout, this event was sort of an inflection point to coordinate the efforts of dozens of organizations trying to mobilize in this new Trump administration. Joining me to talk about that event and also what comes next and the importance of these kinds of inflection points in mass mobilization is the executive director of Women's March, Rachel O'Leary Carmona. Rachel, it's great to see you.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, hanging in there, as we all are.
Like,
yeah. Sometimes it does feel like just like by the skin of my teeth, but we're doing what we can. From where you sit, I'm really interested to hear what you think are the differences between the moment now and the moment in 2017 from an organizing and mobilizing perspective, because I think that a lot of people are looking at that as like an indicator of something, but I think that there are a lot of like important textural and contextual changes that have happened over the past 8 years that are certainly part of what we're thinking about here at Convergence, and I imagine are part of your assessment as well.
mm-hmm. I mean, I think that the difference between 2025 and 2017 is just night and day. You really can't compare the two because we are post COVID, we are post, political violence, we are post George Floyd uprisings, we are two presidential inaugurations in at this point. We are, inside of an ongoing economic, record inflation, all of the things that have been impacting folks all across the country. 2017, there were different internet data rules. There's just a host of things that are apples to oranges. And also, I just think that part of when people are assessing marches or big mobilizations, I'm not sure that people quite get what they do. So the purpose of a big march is not that you walk with your Princess Leia sign past your opposition's window and they're like, I didn't think about it that way. We really got to switch things up. The purpose is to have low bar activities to get people loaded into movement. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we're thinking about movement cycles and trigger moments, the 2017 election was a big one, and it loaded a lot of people into movement. We had another one in 2020. And what ends up happening is an ongoing, and there have been a number of groups who have talked about this movement cycle, that there's a big peak and there's a trigger and it goes down, it goes up, and then there's a normalization higher than what the baseline was to begin with. So there's a finite amount of people that we can load into movement, and marches don't tend to be the thing that people do for their ongoing activism. So marches tend to be a first time thing. Most of us got involved in a march or a protest in the first way. Mine, for example, I was protesting a war and I accidentally got detained, not arrested, I guess, but detained. But it was a protest. I had a sign, and other than the ones after that I have been paid to, as a job that I've organized, I haven't really been to one since, other than the first Women's March where I was not on staff.
Mm-hmm.
I just attended. So I think that as an instrument to really understand the movement, big moments of mass mobilization like that are more about radicalization, who is being brought into the movement, not who is existing inside of the movement. And I think that people are missing a lot of the nuance of that because they want to say, and also 500,000 was a vast undercounting of the first one. The counting of the last one that we did was a vast undercounting. And to the point of your previous guest, there's some real problems that we are facing inside of, preemptive compliance around, the press and censorship. And if you've been online, you've also seen folks from abroad saying we've been protesting in hundreds of thousands and it's getting no coverage and it's getting censored online. So there are a number of things that we have to contend with there, both in the barriers to turnout, the mm-hmm. relative strength of the movement compared to, that time then in terms of how many people are involved, and also just the ways that we hear about things and we learn about things now.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That's a really interesting point also about the sort of like narrative and storytelling aspects of mass mobilization that like it does feel like we're in a moment where the way that sort of mass media pays attention to things like mass mobilization is very cynical in a lot of ways.
Yes.
I mean, honestly, like I feel like this is in some ways like it feels like backlash against the sort of like 2020 racial justice uprising moment. To be honest, like that would be my guess is that like a big piece of that. But yeah, it's and it feels like it's designed to be demobilizing, right? But like
Yes. And I think the question is, who does this narrative serve, right? Because,
right.
you know, my background, I studied, you know, social movements as my undergraduate. I've you know, studied social movements from the United States, you know, and across the world. And the truth of the matter is that there has been no progressive change, you know, inside of you know, principled struggle that was not led by people power. And so the idea of like, this is not the time for mass mobilization, or, you know, and or some of the critique, you know, that we heard at the beginning was, you shouldn't march now because it will be smaller than the first march. And I'm like, well, if the criteria for mobilizing people who by the way want to get active, who were already mobilizing whether we were going to plan a march or not, you know, they were like, we're out here, whether you're out here or not is a little bit irrelevant at this point, you know. So the question is like, if the criteria is we can't do anything if it's not larger than the biggest thing that has ever bigged in the United States, and we're just like, and it's giving, and I really think I say this in the press and they never pick this soundbite up when I say it, but I really feel like it's because it's women who march. And, you know, it's called Women's March, and it's a bunch of women, it's a bunch of queers, it's queer women, it's non-binary folks. And there are more men. Actually, there were significantly more men. We've got some demographics on the last march, and there are more men. But I really believe that if it were just men and the rest of us were, you know, elsewhere, if it were just men who had this largest single day mobilization and then continued to multiple times a year for 8 years, mobilize hundreds of thousands of men into the street over a sustained period of time, they would be like, holy shit, we have a problem to deal with here, you know. But instead it's just like, oh, it's these women, you know, they're, you know. And so I think that the misogyny that drives so much of both the attacks on abortion rights, the attacks on women's healthcare, the attacks on trans people, and just the way that misogyny is one of the rocket fuels of fascism over time in general, historically, really colors the perception of who is going out to march in these moments.
Yeah, that's really, I think, it doesn't surprise me that other outlets are not picking up that kind of analysis, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think that, like, you know, there's ways that we literally see that playing out, whether that was like in the sort of like 20 teens and the way that I feel like the mass media really went out of their way to try to valorize like the Tea Party movement, right?
Yes.
It's like sometimes they'd be like a couple dozen people out at protests. Like somehow this was like some huge thing. Like it's really wild. Well, and I also think that like mass mobilization and the work that you all have done in the last 8 years is not just getting people in the streets, right?
No.
There's so much more to that, and I also think there's a profound lack of understanding in a lot of the ways that media covers social movements, that they don't understand the ways that these things interplay, and I think that like it adds to a kind of like a kind of cynicism about the work that movement organizations do.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a story about like some of the other inflection points that you all have like turned people out and done work on over the past 8 years, is like sort of like telling that deeper story of like what is the fabric that you all have been weaving.
I have a favorite story on that, but before we leave the point, I want to say that it's not just media, it's also the movement and the Democratic Party. Many of whom are operatives who have law degrees, you know, and who understand advocacy as making legislation or passing bills. And so there's a professionalization, and part of the reason why we lost, right, what has been clear in the data that has come back, is that the Democratic Party has become a party of elites. And so part of what our I say our very broadly, even though I don't own some of these pieces, but part of what our problem has been is that we don't trust the people. And inside of movement spaces, that impulse is still there. The movement, the kind of the infrastructure of organizing, and social justice doesn't fully trust organizations that are in the business of getting people into movement. And there's a sense of like, we can't be controlled, the people can't be controlled. And so I actually think that the way that we talk about mass mobilization, the way that we talk about protest, the way that we consider the organizations that do that work is part and parcel of why we lost, and the gap that we absolutely need to bridge before we can win again. So I'm like, before I go to talk on this other thing, I want to start there.
No, that I feel like that's really important though, because I also feel like this is related to this issue also, where it feels sometimes like the only tool in the toolbox is like lawsuits. And first of all,
Yes.
lawsuits are slow, and they also rely on like an infrastructure of, and like, God bless the movement lawyers, we love the shit out of you, but it does rely on this sort of like layer of professionalized, credentialed people,
Yes.
assuming that a legal infrastructure will exist, even, right? That like
Trickle down organizing doesn't work any better than trickle down economics. And like, we have to understand that we have to stop talking about people and acting on people's behalf and acting with people. And a lot of these lawsuits, like, it's not specific to the lawsuits. I know, like,
Sure.
the work that, happened in Texas with the plaintiffs was amazing. And they were very much an active part of this, but we cannot, if Dobbs taught me anything, if the ongoing work taught me anything, is that there is a very significant danger in a single strategy, and we cannot have too many eggs in one basket. And like, this is not a matter of my opinion. This is a matter of the fact that came back. We have not done a good enough job organizing the base. We just haven't. We lost across all demographics. And so like, we need to just be very clear of like, if we don't see, and I say this as an elite, I say this as a person who, has spent most of my career in New York. I've got graduate degrees, all of these things. And so when I'm saying this is as a self-critique, but if I'm trying to be a productive member of either the movement or the Democratic Party, and I'm trying to hang, and I can't see myself in, the conversations about how change gets, the political imagination of what is the vision of our, our side, then I'm not sure how other people see themselves in that too. And I think that's the issue, also related back to the FCC question, or the question about communications, and how what we're talking about matters to what we're trying to do. And I think the question is, it doesn't matter what the narrative is, and it doesn't matter what the channels are that we advance that narrative, if we do not have a clear and compelling vision to move the people towards. And I think that's where we got this year.
No, I think that's quite right. And I mean, you just see that in the way that like the Harris campaign was just like, when they were explicitly asked how they would be different from Biden, they were like, we wouldn't be, like, yo. There's also, I feel funny about interjecting this, but we just published this really great reflection from Emma Tai, who used to be the executive director of United Working Families in Chicago, about this very question, and like the way in which a lot of advocacy leaves behind this question of politics, and like what our goal and our vision is. It's like, it's a truly great article, and like, she pulls in a number of like larger, more substantial pieces of writing, including a couple different books, but it really is worth the read, and I really encourage folks to go check it out on the Convergence website, because this question is a deep and profound one, and similar to, there's not one strategy that's going to, or like channel of tactical action that's going to solve this. There's not just one solution to this question of like, how do we re-inject politics, not like simply elections, but politics as like, what are our goals? What is our policy program? How are we trying to solve for these big questions. There's not just one way to do it, and we need to be in conversation about that right now, urgently.
Right.
So,
and our people are not dumb, so it's like we have to, it's not just about, we have to talk. You had a great article on there saying we can't, I forget what the title was. I'm sure your people will get it in there, but it was like, we have to stop talking in these ways. We have to stop talking like McKinsey consultants inside of the social justice space. And I was like, that's absolutely right. And we have to stop talking about things that don't, resonate with people. So it's not just about how we talk about it, but what are we talking about? We cannot paper over the fact of, the lived experiences of people in this country. We just, we can't, that doesn't work. So you cannot have a successful narrative strategy without a successful organizing strategy that undergirds it. And the successful organizing strategy is rooted in the politics. So that, I think that is the piece. And I really do think that that's the piece of how we continue to get people to turn out, because there are continued moments of radicalization that, we're able to talk about, and people are angry. And to your point of like how we've, like, what does that look like? What is a lifespan of like somebody who, comes out with their Princess Leia sign? I say Princess Leia, I'm telling myself my sign is a Princess Leia sign, because I have been playing Rebel Alliance since other kids were like, playing house. I was absolutely playing Rebel Alliance. And so there's this group that I love to talk about. They're in Enid, Oklahoma, which is not very far. I'm in Amarillo, Texas. So maybe 3 hours, I think, north of me. Very red part of a very red state. Oklahoma is really trying to be what everyone thinks that Texas is right now. Go look at what they're doing. It is awful. Yeah. But they went to a march, I believe around Dobbs, and they organized it in Enid. They said this is the first time since the 70s they took action. They're a group of intergenerational folks, whatever. And then they came out a month later to DC, and we were doing an action that risked arrest. And in that action, they were like, we want to take on another step, and they became marshals for that group. They then went back from DC to Enid, Oklahoma, and they gave the boot to a city council member who was a member of the KKK, and they ran him out of town on a rail. They got him recalled, went and canvassed, and got him kicked out. And they just came to the Oklahoma City, just had a march a couple weeks ago, and they just had a presence there. And so that's the kind of thing that I really like to draw folks' attention to, that it's like, well, first you have a sign and you march, then maybe you're a volunteer at a march, and then maybe you're kicking a KKK member off of the city council. Like, it could get real froggy from there. So like, we just don't know, that is kind of one of the things that's in my mind, because, and I also get back to people saying, well, the numbers question. Again, I'm in Amarillo, and I will tell you, I have been at the head of a 40,000 person march in DC, and I have been with 20 people in Amarillo, and the political courage that it takes to do a march with 20 people in Amarillo or Enid or Oklahoma City or Fargo, North Dakota, or wherever is significantly greater than it takes to get 10,000 people in DC, New York, Austin, what have you. And so I think that we need to understand historically that there's a time and a space for scale, but that scale is actually not a one size fits all indicator for impact. And we have to stop being lazy about how we think about these things.
Well, I mean, I feel like this episode is like full of secret callbacks to like things that I've said in like previous lifetimes of my work. But one of the things I also used to always say at 18 Million Rising was that like scale doesn't necessarily have to be about breadth. It can also be about depth. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
This is definitely something that I learned from the late great Grace Lee Boggs, that sometimes scale is about how deep you go with people, and like the strength of the bonds that you build with the people that you are organizing with. And that like I don't think we live in a media environment that is set up to truly appreciate scale that is not about breadth.
But also, what is your goal, right? So like, if your goal is to run an organization where you get 500,000 people out to a march and you get them all into your mailing list, and now you want to sell canvas bags as a fundraiser to move your work, then maybe there is a theory of change there around getting as many people loaded in, so that you move a lot of petitions, or you do whatever, because you're a digital advocacy organization. And that's fine. There is a need that would be called this like a spoken wheel model. Yeah, we are running a decentralized model. We want ours to look, I'm going to say, because I'm in a nerdy space, in a nerdy safe space, We want our model to look like Jarvis from the Avengers when he's thinking. So we want all the nodes to be connected to the other nodes. And we are not super bothered if after the first march, they are not connecting through us. Matter of fact, the more they're connecting with each other, the better, because that is actually a network that is denser. And there's actually an equation to measure network density that we apply. And so what we are going for, Women's March was born big. We don't have a choice about that. Like we were born as a moment in a groundswell. And we've always just been big, but that doesn't mean that like big is actually the less important part. And I think dense, and especially as we're moving into this time where we're going to have to keep each other safe, we're going to have to think about ways that we provide for resources for ourselves that do not include the state. In fact, the state may be hostile to, including ways that we get safe food, safe water, safe medical, treatment, all of those things. The dense networks are the ones that are going to survive. Yeah. And so that's what we focus towards. And so when people are like, oh, it's not the biggest thing ever, it's like, well, that's not the goal, Yeah.
Well, and I think, like, to that point, I've seen your colleague Tamika Middleton talk a lot about political homes. Yes. And that I think that, like, in, like, mainstream discourse about the work that you all do, I feel like that is, like sort of this, like, contextless, like, sort of, like, hanging thing that people are like, sounds good, right? But, like, what is a political home? And, like, clearly you are speaking to some of the things that are crucial about why we need to find our political homes in this moment.
Right. I think that, political homes, the idea has shifted so much, I think, over time. Like when I grew up, people used to say, as both a measure of pride and a measure of insult, they're a card-carrying ACLU member. Which you could take one way or the other, you know what I mean? And
I think it originally started as an insult.
Yeah, I think it did too, but and so but then you'll see shifting, for example. And so right after, what was really interesting is that right after the election, there was pushback around mobilization, like, is it the time to mobilize or not? And people were like, they're going to say it's smaller, which it was. And I was like, every mobilization that's happened has been smaller, but they were like, they're going to talk about one way or the other. Our calculus was one way or the other. They're going to critique, because before we had called for the march, they were like, where's the pussy hats now? You know what I mean?
Right. Like, you kind of can't win against the haters.
Yeah, you can't. And so we were like, well, we're going to catch a beating regardless. So we might as well catch it for doing action. But, a card-carrying member of the of the ACLU, or you wear a pussy hat, or, your NPR bag, or, like whatever the, if you drive a Prius, there are certain, signalings of like what kind of place you occupy in the world based on, what have you. And I think that being a card-carrying member of the ACLU may have been, part of what folks felt like a political home. But in the decimation in the 90s of our third spaces, political homes have come to mean, different things and play in different ways. And I think that with those third spaces disappearing, there was a period of time where inside of movement spaces, we were building vehicles. And I would say that some of those vehicles have been, very successful. And maybe where we overcorrected was that we were building we were building maybe a little too heavy on the home and not strong enough on the political, because inside of coalition spaces, if we're comfortable, our coalitions are probably too small. And I think that when a mistake that our side tends to make is that we're looking for people with whom, to build with people with whom we agree. And I think that we have to begin to broaden that bigger we and really lean into pluralism. It really brings up some thorny questions about like, okay, well, where are the red lines? So for example, for Women's March, if someone might want to partner with us that says, well, we are feminists and we are progressive, but we do not believe in bodily autonomy. We would say those two things are mutually exclusive. But, it really does bring up questions that we have to grapple. We talk a lot on the left about grappling with things, and I've never actually been in a grapple in the movement, so that's really interesting. And I do like a grapple, so I'm open to it. It's an invitation. But I do think that we have to think about, like, as we need to work on, we have to win. We have to contest for the folks that we lost.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that look like? And where can we, when folks go to MAGA, I don't think that most people are like, oh my God, I'm a militia member and I am a raging racist and I am whatever. They probably say, listen, the eggs are too high. They're like, great. You come on over here and guess what? We're going to get you to the rest of those places in a solid 6 months' time. And so what does it look like to have the same kind of organizing commitment and mandate on the left to say, you don't have to, we're going to meet you where we found you, but we refuse to leave you there. We're going to bring you along. But but political homes necessarily mean we don't have to be friends. In fact, we can actively dislike each other. That is like canon inside of anything that you've read about the civil rights movement. There was active beef between these groups. So it's like,
totally.
How can we get past, all of the nonsense and get to winning for each other? And I think that is the real difference between a social club or an affinity group and a political home.
Yeah. No, that is very rich, what you just said. Like, there's a lot going on there. And I think that, like,
I'm very caffeinated.
One of the things that occurs to me in what you're saying too is just that, like, I think also about all the people who chose the couch over MAGA, right? That it wasn't just that we lost people to the right in this election. It was also that we lost people to being like, what does it fucking matter, right?
Yes. And that just speaks to the vision. Like, if I tell you to close your eyes and I say, make America great again, what would you know what I mean? Like, some of us might think of like Parable of the Sower. Some of us might think of Leave It to Beaver. Some of us might think of whatever, but it's very clear. It's dystopian. It's a minority rule, white supremacist vision of the world. And when I say, like, we don't even have a slogan, like, we don't have those messages, but we also don't have a clear vision of what it looks like. Because are we a world that's for militarism or against militarism? Are we a world that is for, bodily autonomy and, against misogyny and for, self-determination? Or did we go too far with the trans thing? Or maybe we shouldn't have focused on women. Where was the leftist outcry with our body? Your body, our choice. When misogyny went up by 4,600% after the election and the left was silent, so I'm like, there are so many times when the left has not flanked, when we talked about this election, saying this is about abortion, this is about education, attacks on trans people. It's going to be about attacks on immigrants. It's going to be about the economy. But I mean, working inside of space, I've worked in the LGBTQ space, and I've worked in, women's, gender justice and women's rights for almost my whole career. And I will tell you that we are very uncommonly flanked by the fuller left, very uncommonly. Like, and when we do, we have to beg and trade favors and, play tit for tat. And it's like, I think that sexism, misogyny, and all of the ways that feeds into both, bodily autonomy issues as it pertains to both abortion and trans issues, is really a bipartisan problem. And I think that we have to face up to that, before we can move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think immigration is the same way right now. That, like, the fact that the Democratic Party has done so little to stand up to this, like, patently absurd shit, and like helping pass the Lake and Riley Act is like, it's an embarrassment, frankly. And I think it does go to show that it does, like, how little power we as like the, like, organized left has in this country, that, like, they're
and
so
even the lack of rigor, the Latino vote. There's no such thing. Like, I'm a Mexican, I live in Texas. You know what I mean? And everyone's saying, oh, well, Mexicans vote, like, broke for Trump. Well, like, you don't, where do you organize? Like, what is the organizing strategy to work with specific, communities on issues? What is the outreach strategy, And again, when so much of our strategy is coming from multi-million-dollar consulting shops that are inside of the Acela corridor, then when most people if I'm wrong about this, you could correct me, but my understanding is that most queer people live in the South.
Yes.
Like some of the biggest voting blocks, Mexicans live in the South. So then when you're not talking to people and other folks are organizing those people, if you're not, the cardinal rule of organizing is if you are not organizing that person, someone else is. And we ceded way too much ground. And then we're there like surprised Pikachu when the vote didn't go our way. Like, what did you expect? Yeah. What did you expect? We have to lean back into, kind of the foundational values, both of our, of progressive or leftist, wherever you fall there, but also of just straight up how change happens, which is that you have to organize with people, you have to trust people, you have to build relationships. Big data, texting, and multi-million-dollar ad buys is not going to get it done. And I don't know how many times we have to get a board in the face before we figure that out.
Keep walking on that dang rake.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that like what you are describing to me is also the heart of, I think, what the task is for Block and Build in this moment, right? That like we need to get serious about blocking, but we cannot abandon this build. And the build is both how do we build the infrastructure and how do we build that sort of like deep connection and thick network that we need to keep each other safe, but also how do we build a vision, a positive vision of what we're building towards, so that when the time comes for us to contend for power in a different way, more people can get on board with that vision because they know what it means for them and their families, and their like livelihoods and experiences like human beings. So,
and as a movement, I feel like we often have invitations to the base and demands of elected officials, sometimes corporate interests, whatever. But I think that there is a person missing there, or a group of people missing there. And I would say we are not making enough demands of ourselves. And I think that we need to approach this moment with some rigor, and understanding that, for example, in the state that we are in now, the goal, I think that a lot of folks were so disillusioned by, the election, more than just that the candidate didn't win, but because their end goal was really, getting their candidate elected. And at that point, they didn't have a political analysis of, kind of the rise of authoritarianism and fascism. And that it's really about like winning elections. Like winning elections is how we build governing power, and that's how we win. And obviously we have to do that. But the work was going to, like, our work plan did not change an iota from losing, because we were always inside of this organizing work, and our eyes have always been on a 25-year, strategy. And so I think that we have to get really clear here and say that, of course, we have to win in 2026. Of course, we have to build governing power. Of course, we have to try to do everything that we can to flip the House. But that alone is not enough. And we have to understand that putting people who are on our side, and I also have to draw our attention back to some questions about what our side means when, the polling that has come out has saying like, hey, a lot of people who did choose the couch did so because the Democratic Party was not representing the people's views on things like militarism and the economy and, all of those things. And so we have to contend with what happens. And I don't, I'm clear, of the realities of the situation. I was at the ERA press conference when the ERA, when Biden published the ERA. I was standing right next to Cori Bush, and I'm like, this is what happens when you hold to your principles, and you can, the system will, spit you out, because she held to her principles and she fought the good fight, but the flank was not strong enough, and we lost. And I hope that she comes back, but we also have to be clear: the system will fight back, like the empire strikes back, and so we have to understand that it's not enough to put more of us inside of a fundamentally, terminally flawed system. We have to change the system itself. We have to, reach for a bolder vision that is more liberatory, and it's not going to be a 2-year strategy. It's not even going to be a 4-year strategy. It's not even a generational strategy. And we have to think bigger and bolder, especially in this moment when our people are going to be faced with alternatives that are unacceptable. So we need to be acceptable. We need to be popular. We need to be so attractive in our vision and in the way that we welcome people in and in the way that we organize and in our politics, that we are irresistible and people choose to come over.
Yes.
That's our job.
Yeah. And it's a tall order. We're up against a lot of things, structural things that keep us from succeeding at that. But I'm really glad to be in the struggle with you, Rachel.
Me too. I love it here.
I can imagine doing no other thing with my time, to be honest.
Whenever I'm like real crazy, like I just can't, like whatever, I'm like, I'm going to go over to Convergence Mag and see what they're talking about today. And that's why I'm always like sending all staff. If you see a whole bunch of people reading, it's like, it's me sending it to all the staff, be like, everyone has to read this about messaging. I think you all are doing such amazing work, because what I really think is that it's really easy for a lot of us to get caught up in, as everybody does. Like my brother works in construction, and he'll be like, well, we were doing this OSHA thing and we had a supervised lift and we were, you know what I mean? And I don't like, I'm hanging on, like I'm fighting for my life in every conversation while he's telling me about work, So it's not specific to our, jobs, but we do get lingo-y and like, and we are in one of the few places where we cannot afford to talk or think in ways that are inaccessible, because that's actually necessarily not radical. If it's not for folks, if we can't bring folks along who don't dwell in politics, we're not being radical. We're not serving our goals. And really no one wants to have a conversation with the smartest, smarmiest person in the room. So I think that we just have to work to be approachable in real life in our politics, while have to be informed by so many things, have to walk and talk with real people. And we can't be like, oh, here's this sanctimonious leftist coming in again with, like a metal tumbler of kombucha to talk about sustainability or whatever, you know what I mean? Like we need to be joyful. And I don't just mean going to parties, but in our organizing strategy, Barbara Smith always tells me joy is not a political goal. And I'm like, no, but it is a tactic. It is a tactic. And I think that if hectoring and haranguing and shaming people worked, we would have won in a landslide. And we didn't. So we need to be strong enough to look within and choose another way.
Yeah. And I think that, like, part of the reason that we do what we do here at Convergence is also trying to have that conversation internally.
And I love that, because you all do it in a way that that is kind and approachable, but doesn't lose its sharpness. And I think that's exactly what we need, like the rigor. But we have to be a movement that people want to join. And there are some times that I get off calls and I'm like, I do not want to be on this. I don't want to be here.
I know what you mean. And like, I think for me that like one of the great beauties of actually this show is like having these kind of like very candid conversations with folks in ways that are like, no, like actually we're just kind of sitting in my living room, because we are sitting in my living room.
Because we are.
I appreciate you so much, Rachel. Thank you for having
me.
Yeah, thanks for making time in this busy time to yap with me a little bit about where we are and where we're going. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Hopefully. Have a good one. Thanks for having me.
My thanks again to Stephen Renderos of Media Justice for joining me earlier, and for Rachel O'Leary Carmona of the Women's March. We will include links to plug into the work of both of their organizations in the show notes. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Kaden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David is our production assistant and does our social media. If you've got something to say, please do drop me a line. You can send an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And of course, if you would like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build this map for our movements. I hope this helps.